Shalom, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. This is the first time we meet with all our life hostages home. Hodul Hashem Ki Tov. Our soldiers continue to fight. There are still bodies to return. There are things which continue to challenge the Jewish people, but the sense of relief for those 20 people, for their families, for the Jewish people is indescribable. And the shift in tone in Israel and the wider Jewish world is indescribable. And especially as we've spoken every week that we've been together, we've davened together, we've learned together, we've hoped together, we've cried together. And it's important to thank God together and say that though there's a long journey still to go, boy, oh boy, the past week was a step in the right direction. And it's so heartening to see such beautiful images of reunions, obviously at the same time marred with aches and pains of lost time, lost opportunities, lost people, of lost innocence. All of that is true, and that breaks our heart. Like I've said on a number of occasions, the Zohar talks about how the heart has two chambers, one in which we used to weep and one in which we celebrate with joy. And both those chambers have been challenged, with the weeping overused and the joy underused. And Baruch Hashem, there was a slight rebalancing last week. And we hope obviously for a time when the chamber of joy is far fuller than that of weeping. It's also a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Melissa and Matan for our opportunity to learn together and to start a new course together. I think it's our 7th year. Each year we've done something completely different based on either suggestions on my part or feedback that we've had. And that keeps me on my toes, but also it reminds us there's so much to learn. And this year we're going to do something quite different. It's not in the pure field of machshava or halacha or Tanakh even, although we've touched on all of those over the years. Instead, it's in the field of, shall we say, spiritual biography. We're going to be looking at the spiritual biographies of the Tanaim and Amoraim, our great sages. When we say the sages say, we're often referring to the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud. I mean, we sometimes refer to later sages with that term, but Chachamim in the classic usage refers to the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Gemara. And that being said, many of us know very little about them. We know them as names. We know a handful of stories which perhaps are more popular, but we don't necessarily know how they connect, maybe when they lived or where they lived and how they lived and how that might shape the things they say. I say might because we should be wary. We shouldn't presume that knowing a person's historical context automatically explains each one of their halachic positions. But arguably, knowing a little bit more about the teachers whose Torah we learn helps us better understand a little bit about their context and perhaps might also help us understand their Torah. So this course is both history and biography. It's also learning Mishnah and Talmud because we're going to be looking at various different teachings and exploring their meaning. It's a little bit of geography, a little bit of sociology, but more importantly, it's taking our rabbinic literature even more seriously by looking at the gaps in our knowledge and trying to fill them. And that's our goal. So we call the course the Tanaim Amoraim. In this course, we will learn about our great Tanaim and Amoraim and consider their teachings in light of their personal, ideological, and historical circumstances. And before we talk about some of the things we're going to cover this year, I want to mention some of the work, some of the books which have informed my preparation of this course and will continue to inform. Obviously, I've prepared a number of our classes full and some, obviously, on a much more skeleton basis. But what I'd like us to do is think about what we're going to study and then, let me first share with you what we're going to study and then tell you the kind of works which informed the planning of this course. So I want you to look at this handout titled the Tanaim and Amoraim, or it's probably titled in the PDF schedule for students or something like that. And this is a suggested schedule, meaning it may slightly change. They give me some little bit of wiggle room, but this is the proposed flow of study for our next 30 or so sessions. There's 31, but one is a Pesach session. So we have 30 sessions in which we're going to be talking about our Tanaim and Amoraim. So even, obviously, you have the numbers of the classes, the dates. I want to look in that middle column, introduction. You see then you have Zugot, Tanaim, Israel, Amoraim, Bavel, Amoraim. Right? It's important to know that there was a period called the Zugot, the pairs. We see them referenced in Pirkei Avot. And we're going to be learning about those pairs before we get to the Tanaim, because historically they preceded the Tanaim. The Tanaim are sages from sages who contributed to the Mishnah from the time of the Mishnah, living in Israel, and we have a list of the highlights that we're going to cover. And then we have Amoraim, those who comment on the Mishnah, who contributed to both the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud in Israel, the Talmud Bavli, the Talmud in Bavel. Some of those Amoraim only lived in Israel or only lived in Bavel, some traveled. And we see lots of references of words being passed from one sage to another, and meetings occurring from different sages of different places. And here I've listed the main headings of the main Amoraim that I wish us to cover. Obviously, there are more. That being said, one needs to know where to draw a line. So what I want you to first see is some of these names should be familiar from Pirkei Avot. Now, one of the reasons why Pirkei Avot is a significant book isn't just because it lists the names, but actually Pirkei Avot is the most formal work by the rabbis listing chronologically the rabbi, meaning we have other works we're going to be referencing in a second, academic works or later rabbinic works, on and others, Rambam himself listing the stages, but the rabbis themselves delineate the chronology of the rabbis almost most clearly in Pirkei Avot, even though it's not particularly a history book, but part of the first chapter is about the idea of Masorah, transmission. And so by wishing to talk about transmission, it tells us there were this generation and that generation, these sages and that sages. There were teachings in Pirkei Avot of certain sages where we don't hear from them elsewhere. And there are obviously teachings of certain sages elsewhere, which we don't hear of them in Pirkei Avot. That being said, some of these sages, especially the Zugot, are most notably known from their featuring in the Pirkei Avot and some of the Tanaim as well, obviously not Amoraim. And we're going to learn about those people and learn some of their Torah and try and explore the relationship between them, let's say their family background, their historical background, and their Torah teachings. Some will be fact and some will be mere conjecture. But my feeling is that the very act of taking time to ask ourselves, just to take a random example, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, right? We've heard his name. How would my learning of his teachings change if I know a little bit more about Rabbi Elazar ben Arach? Well, if I know nothing now, and then I have a sense of when he lived, and who were his friends, and what was going on around him, maybe, just maybe, I might be able to understand his teachings a little bit more. And we'll see that in a second. Because when we look at Pirkei Avot, do we ever ask ourselves, why does this sage say this thing and this sage say that? I mean, if they all believe that all of his wisdom, right, why does that sage choose to make that statement theirs? And why is that sage renowned for that statement? It may be perhaps just personal preference, but it might well be because this is an important thing for them to say in that time. This was their flagship idea, which they needed to teach in that moment. That means that, to take simply Pirkei Avot as an example, you can't understand Pirkei Avot unless you know why, or at least unless you consider why that sage decided to make this teaching something that, is perhaps on their epitaph, right? Something which we continually associate with them. Now, just before we look at to another page and the books I brought, any questions just about the page I've got in front of me or the one that you have in front of you?
Maybe we'll come to the answers to the questions I've got when you carry on.
Okay, Priscilla.
Yeah, otherwise I'll make.
So this is again the proposed timeline of learning, and some people are going to look at more depth, some not. some perhaps I've added too many in one kind of slot and too few in another. But if there's an individual person, it's because either they're incredibly important or they represent a chapter of time which is so incredibly important that their life is going to be a window onto a certain time or event or shift which we would well to pay attention to. So that's that. Let me now tell you about some of the books which have informed my preparation, some of which you may have at home, some of which you may not. And you don't need to buy any of them, but if you wish to, perhaps now is a good time to ponder that. So I'm going to start in no particular order. There was actually it was originally 3 volumes, then it became 1 volume. There was a 3-volume and then 1-volume book titled The Jewish Spiritual Heroes by a gentleman called Gershon Bader. I have the older edition, right? Mishnah, Jerusalem Talmud, Babylonian Talmud. It was then published by Aronson in a big blue book under, I think, the similar title, if not the same. And this contains chapters about the Tanaim and Amoraim, quoting their teachings, giving us a little bit about their background, and talking about their relationships with other scholars. It's really easy to read, and it's a really wonderful book. And the bonus is that this entire book, which was written in English, is available online in Sefaria, meaning you can get you can read the entire book on Sefaria. Interestingly, sometimes Sefaria has titles in Hebrew and English, but if you search the Jewish spiritual heroes, you can find the whole thing.
Can you send
So I can send, yeah, I can send. Sure. Bader, Bader. Gershon Bader's The Jewish Spiritual Heroes. As I say, it's really, really wonderful.
Can you put it on the WhatsApp group?
We'll put it on the WhatsApp group.
All right, thank you.
So I highly recommend it because, firstly, everybody can get it online for free, and secondly, because it's very readable, and thirdly, because in terms of the English language, it was/is arguably one of the best books that try to do this. He's not trying to convince us about stuff. He's just trying to tell us the lives of the sages whose Torah we learn, but also referencing sources. So he'll say this about this particular person's life. And then remember this event, or we learn a detail about that person from that event, which helps us understand that next event. So, so we're going to come to him now. In Hebrew, Rabbi Dr. Benny Lau wrote a series called Chachamim, and that's been translated into the series called The Sages. That's available now in 5 volumes. And Rabbi Lau, this book, The Jewish Spiritual Heroes, is meant to be, shall we say, pure historical spiritual biography. Wasn't particularly shaped around Pirkei Avot. Rabbi Lau's book is based around a shir that he initially gave about Pirkei Avot. So he has a deliberate order, which is much more chronological than Rabbi Bader's book. And Benny Lau's book are wonderful. He actually sometimes posits things a lot broader and a lot wider than necessarily Rabbi Bader, who's trying to be much more of a purist, whereas Benny Lau would say, based on my understanding of this scholar and based on this teaching, I think X. And it makes it really, really fascinating reading. And although I had obviously read a number of these books, I recently bought all 5. There's, it's a series of 5. Yeah, we work with what we have. But there is a good discount. So they're really.
They're very nice.
Right. So I recommend for those who really want, it's a good investment. And you wouldn't just read them once, you'd go back to them. Anytime you learn a Mishnah, Talmud, and a certain sage is mentioned, his essays help you say, oh, I understand this. And sometimes just a throwaway remark there can really change the way in which you look at a particular scholar. In addition to that, there are encyclopedias of Talmudic sages, some much more lengthy. There's a whole Sidra by Mossad Rav Kook, which I don't know if all the volumes are still available. They were published some decades ago. There is a 2-volume series called Encyclopedia Lechachmei Talmud Ba'Gaonim, which I have. I know sometimes people think that colorful books are kind of mean they're just for children. They're not. This is a great series, right? It's great. And what this does is it doesn't go as deep as Ben Hillel or even as Rabbi Beda. What it really tries to focus on is when did this rabbi live? Who are his contemporaries? And what particular details may be useful for us to know when thinking about him or her for that matter. And it has some nice tables as well. It's quite pleasant in terms of the presentation. So I reference this quite often. I mean, when I write something every day on Daf Yomi, when I have a little bit more time, I do a deeper dive. I'm just asking myself, when did this sage live? Who were his contemporaries? Why is this person disagreeing with this individual? That's worthwhile noting. So this gives the basics really nicely. This gives more information. Rabbi Lau, I know I'm saying this, nobody can see. Rabbi Lau does a deeper dive, but at the same time, again, positing different ideas. I'll mention something else, which perhaps some of you don't know of, but I highly recommend. Just round the corner, literally, from here is Rabbi Yaakov Hebershel. And he's a great scholar. And he wrote a book some years ago titled The Levavot, which is a commentary on Pirkei Avot, while looking at the biographies of the scholars and trying to explain why they said what they said in their teachings. And it's really a very sophisticated commentary. And this is it. So it's a single volume. So if you want to learn Pirkei Avot with a focus on who is the author, what are they saying, why are they saying these things, this is mind-blowing. It's not just good, it's really, really unbelievable. He also posits a range of ideas. Sometimes he'll challenge other academics and say, this person said this rabbi was a contemporary of this, but it's not true because we know it from that. So though it looks like a classic rabbinic work, it kind of veers into the world of academia, while at the same time giving us spiritual context. Because at the top, he has a commentary called Lev Avot, which, shall we say, is a spiritual commentary on Pirkei Avot. And the bottom, Banim Alavotam, is more about rabbinic biography. So if you don't have this, and you're interested in learning a little bit more about this subject, or learning Pirkei Avot from a different way, then I highly recommend it. And again, it should be more popular than perhaps it is. I don't know how popular it is in Ramat Bet Shemesh, but in my little Bet Midrash at home, it's popular to me. You may have, or you may know of, the Steinsaltz reference guide to the Talmud. So some years ago, obviously when Rabbi Steinsaltz wrote his translation on the Talmud, originally in Hebrew, and then it was translated into English, he created this reference guide, basically the kind of things you should know to learn Mishnah and Talmud better. So there's a chapter on halachic weights and measures. There's a chapter on certain Talmudic phrases.
But we had that class.
Right.
Phrases.
So he also has a few sections just about when certain sages lived. And the way in which he tabulated things was very, very neat, and actually inspired a whole bunch of other people to do similar things. And so, I mean, this is only a few pages, and I've actually scanned one or two tables, which we're going to look at in a second. But if you have this book, I highly recommend it. Some years ago, Art Scroll came out with something similar, like an introduction to the Talmud. I don't have it, but I know it's meant to be, in their own way, a similar version to this. And I'm quite sure it contains also information about the Tanaim and Amoraim. So it's worthwhile mentioning that too. What other one? Yeah, and there are a few other things, classic works called Seder HaDorot, which lists where certain sages say certain things. Other classic works, Rabbi Hyman's book, which Ben Hillel mentions in his introduction. But some of those are either academic or out of print. But these are the kind of books on my shelf which I reference when trying to learn about our sages and when preparing this course, as well as a few other things too. But we don't need to belabor that point. Either which way, there is no single book, or there's no single site which tells you everything. And it's important to note. Like I mentioned, that this one tells me when these people live. This one explains to me why they said certain things in Pirkei Avot. This one talks about their contemporaries. This one talks about the historical context a little bit more. This one talks a little bit more about their teachings. I often find I need all of that information, which is why I have a whole shelf on these kind of topics. So when you're exploring sages, asking all those questions I think is important, and you bring together information. But as I say, I don't know of one single book which talks about a full comprehensive understanding of the historical, sociological context and their peers and their teachings, right? I don't think it fully exists, or necessarily even the things that animate them. So what I didn't mention before is, here is a chapter in a sophisticated Talmudic book called Kovetz Yesodot V'Chakirot. Actually, it's the older edition. The new edition doesn't have this. I didn't bring it to you, which lists some of the things that interested certain sages. For example, certain sages like making general principles, right? So we find that oftentimes they'll say the klal is X. Certain sages often will look at kind of a big picture way of looking at a particular topic, and others will look much more in terms of the specifics. Certain sages prefer reading biblical texts in certain ways versus other ways. We can even see this in this week's Daf Yomi with Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Knowing that helps. You can't almost reverse engineer to understand somebody's biography based on any individual debate in the Talmud. But once you know a little bit about that person, you may be able to understand that debate a little bit better. So again, this is just an interesting piece, worthwhile bearing in mind. I'm going to pause. Any questions about the things I've said so far? Okay. So what I've given you out so far is this schedule. We'll look at this example in a minute, but I now want to bring to your attention this 6-page set of maps and tables. And we're going to spend some time dwelling on it. Okay, so this is our first class is not going to be the way the rest of the classes work. The rest of the class, we're going to be looking at particular people. But here I'm trying to give a broader overview. And in this packet, we have a number of things. On the first 2 pages are maps, shall we say, almost family trees, but not really family, but instead scholarly trees, right? Describing the Tanaim and Amoraim in terms of their chronology, their relationships, their importance. So on page 1, you see that. I've numbered the pages. On page 2, you see that with the Amoraim of Israel, the Amoraim of Bavel. We're going to come back to this in a second, okay? So on page 3, you see maps of Israel and Babylon in the time of the Mishnah and Talmud. That's important because some people lived near each other and some people didn't. In page 4, you see a list of what we describe as different generations of the Tanaim and Amoraim, meaning the Tanaim lasted about 200 years, which means there's multiple generations. So,
Rabbi, I don't care, but if you want me to take that, give it to me.
That's relevant because if you know that 2 sages lived in different generations, you know that when the rabbis say they debated, they didn't, right? So sometimes, for example, the Talmud will have a fictionalized debate between 2 sages that could never have met because they lived 50 years, right, between the death of one and the birth of another. We realize, oh, what they're really doing is they're almost imagining a conversation, right? So knowing when people lived matters. Also knowing when they lived in terms of events taking place. If somebody creates a prayer against missionaries and they're living in the time of the early church, well, the likelihood is they're saying something about the early church. I mean, you have to recognize that. So if they live in the year 100, 150, and we know what's going on in Israel at the time, then that innovation, which we have, Lamashanim, right? That innovation is likely to be prompted by events taking place around them. And then you need to do a little bit of a deeper dive. So that gives you a general overview. And then the next 2 pages, we have a list of those particular sages. The first table being the Tanaim, and the second being Amoraim. Not all of them, but many of them. So getting a sense of relationships, location, chronology, interrelationships is essential. This is really going to be our Bible for the entire course. We're going to be referencing this the whole time. Yeah.
Is it possible that this little booklet you made, you could put it on PDF on the WhatsApp,
Yeah.
so we
Yeah,
could
it is
open
already.
it every week?
Yeah,
And then we can, each week we can open
on
it
the
to
Google
whatever we're
Drive.
learning about.
Yeah.
because we don't
That's
really-
absolutely
It's on
fine.
Google Drive.
But if you set it on the WhatsApp, it's just easier for us to open each week.
So let's just have a look at this table, just the first one.
Yeah.
Right? Again, and I have no agenda here. I just want us to kind of almost surf this image, right? And some of the sages we see here obviously are more familiar, some less. You see on the right-hand side a depiction of when they lived. On the right of the right-hand side is the Hebrew year, and the left of the right-hand side is the secular year. You know, is there anything that jumps out from this first page where it says Tanaim, page 1 of the table, that you think, what? I didn't realize that person lived then, or I didn't realize that person's student was their student. It's a little bit small, I apologize. I mean, take a simple example. You know, we often talk about Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, but though those are generic terms, there were particular students who were particular students of Hillel and Shammai. So knowing that obviously means that if you're learning a teaching of Yochanan ben Zakkai, the likelihood is that it's going to be aligned with various teachings of Hillel. If you're learning a teaching of Rav Dosa ben Harkinas, it's likely to be aligned with the teachings of Shammai. But just meaning simply, I generally try not to say things which are radically different to my teacher unless I radically disagree with him on something, because if he chose me to be his students and I chose him to be my teacher, that means there's some kind of alignment in terms of our worldview. So we often will quote, this person's quoted their teacher saying X, but sometimes we don't have that. And yet, obviously, what they're saying is likely to have been shaped by their teachers. So know a person's teacher helps you know them, helps you know, perhaps, again, why they may hold a particular view.
The Shammai just ends with these three. Ben Harkanes.
Well, the short answer is this table is about, you know, delineating explicit names explicitly connected to explicit people. But we have this thing called Bet Shammai, which is a whole school of thought, which are generic. So I wouldn't say Shammai ends there, and we trace certain scholars to be part of that. I mean, I wouldn't take this as the be all and end all. There are various attempts to make maps, and none of them are perfect. This is one of the better ones. But obviously the best way to know is going to be through the learning of people.
Excuse me. Do we know anything about Torah study before then?
The Zugot. The Zugot are pre and Anshe Knesset Gdolah before the Zugot. And then before Anshe Knesset Gdolah, we're in the Tanakh time, right?
Yeah.
So what we're going to be doing in the next couple of sessions is talking about those early periods of time. For example, almost all our prayers were constructed before all of these people by the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, right? The Talmud says explicitly that all the blessings and prayers were made by the men of the Great Assembly. We're going to discuss who they are. We should also ask why. You know, why are they? They're pre the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple happens after that point in time. That happens. Happens after the time of Hillel. And so, why are they constructing prayers? Why aren't they constructing blessings? We often think that prayers and blessings are a response to the destruction. Well, actually, the prayers and blessings were created before the destruction. Not all, but some. So why? I mean, but of course, we need to realize there was also an exile. Yeah, when Babel, right?
And they didn't come back, obviously.
Right. So understanding when certain things were formulated and by whom gives us a better sense and sentiment of the intent of those initiatives, right? I say better sense. We can't always know for sure. and we also need to be humble, right? Unless our sage says something explicitly or it's evidently proven, we can postulate. But I think postulating is still a good idea.
Curious.
Good question. We will come to that soon. We'll come to that soon, and we're gonna delineate either the ones that haven't been listed. I mean, I mentioned before in terms of the table of Rabbi Steinsaltz, he has a more generic table, which I've prepared to be as a more detailed one. So I can show you in a second, and he lists all the sages of the Talmud. But even just noticing how certain people are contemporaries and how they come from different, shall we say, worlds, helps us perhaps better understand debates. I mentioned that Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva often disagree on things. Heschel has a whole book on that, right? Heavenly Torah. He explains how the underpinnings of the debates between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva are reflective of two very different worldviews. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. That's irrelevant. When you know the biography of people, you say, okay, I can see how they're coming from slightly different influences and influencers. They're living in the same time, but they're seeing the world differently. Then our job is to ask, why do they do that? And how do they do that? And that's what we're going to try and do better. So even, again, on Shabbat, in general, I try and look through the week stuff here because I try and write something every day. So as I mentioned, in the next day or two, there's a debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, and one of the many. But this already being pretty prominent in my mind because we were going to have our session today. I was thinking, is their debate reflective of just the micro issue they're debating, perhaps? But is it reflective, perhaps, of a much, much broader, different philosophy? We've probably heard Divrei Torah, the place where this is most prominent in terms of Divrei Torah learned and shared is where we talk about the machloket between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai on Chanukah, whether you liked 8 to 1 and 1 to 8. What many people don't realize is there's a tremendous amount of literature about the different philosophical approaches to halacha, Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. There's about, and so in each of those lead to a different conclusion as to why it's 1 to 8 to 8 to 1, right? The Rogachovas wrote a lot about that amongst other people. And if that's their debates, of which there are about 300 machlakot between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, which means that it's unlikely to have had 300 completely unique, discrete disagreements, which aren't reflective of a deeper difference in way of looking at life. So too, we have different sages who are seemingly constantly at loggerheads. It's probably not just to do with those individual reasons for disagreeing, but based on a subtle, different way of seeing the world. If you have a friend that you're always disagreeing with her about different things, it's most likely there is either personality trait which one of you has that the other doesn't, or it's different. It's your disagreements are more likely to be beyond that particular subject and instead essential to the personalities involved. So that's what we're going to try and explore. That's the Tanaim. If you turn the page, we have the Amoraim. And obviously learning who is living in Israel, who is living in Bavel, matters. It simply matters. It matters because you know who is having a easier life and who is having a harder life. Of course, in the time of the Amoraim, as well as the Tanaim, but here there are two parallel schools. The Amoraim of Eretz Israel had a much more challenging time than those in Bavel, and that's reflective in the work that they produced, the Talmud Bavli versus the Talmud Yerushalmi, etc. So again, if you look at this table, maybe there are things that jump out that make you say, wow, I didn't realize that. Maybe not. But we're going to be looking at these and looking at these and looking at these once again. And I think this is going to make us look differently at the text that we study and at the Torah that we learn. Any particular things spring out from what we've got here? We're going to put this down in a second.
Then is a term for all of these sages.
Yes.
Okay. Then what were the Saboraim?
Okay, so we have names for people who live after these sages. So let's go back. We have Nevi'im, Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, Zugot, Tanaim, Amoraim. Okay? Amoraim take you, there's debates as to when the Talmud is fully finished. Meaning, the rabbis say, Rabbeinu Rav Ashi, that's the end of the Talmud. It's not, that doesn't mean that that's when the Talmud as we have on the shelves is fully written, right? There were other sages who appended things to the Talmud that we have today. Okay, so there was a hot debate which was stimulated or really developed by a scholar who passed away a few years ago, Rabbi Dr. David Weiss Halivni, about whether there's a generation called the Tanaim. So, why do we say that? Because in the Talmud, there are often discussions which seem to be unauthored. It's as if there seems to be a anonymous editor of the Talmud who has shaped the text itself. Okay, so he called those Tanaim. We often call about the Stam Gemara. Stam meaning generic. No, Stam. That's Stam. Stam means generic rather than Stam means Sefer Torah and Tefillin and Mezuzot, right? Anonymous. Then you have the Savoraim. So meaning the period after the close of the Talmud, so it's not entirely true. The period after the Tanaim is called the Savoraim. Now, who are the Savoraim? They are a less than well-known, less than fully understood generation of scholars, of which all we know is that in the Igeret of Shira Gaon, he says that there are a few pieces in the Talmud which were appended to it, which are Savoraik. He says, for example, like the first couple of pages in Masechet Kiddushin. When you look at the first couple of pages of Masechet Kiddushin, there is no creative halachic conversation. There is almost word analysis. And it seems to be that there was a certain generation who were trying to make sense of the works of the previous generation while trying to put together the works of the previous generation. We call those Savoraim. And then we have the Geonim, and then we have the Rishonim, and then we have the Achronim.
Distinctions, like who decided these are the Tanaim and these are the Amoraim and these are the whatever else?
So they're reflected both by in the kind of work that was done, focus that was done. Okay, I'll ask a question, almost in a silly way. Imagine you go into a professional kitchen. Why is a dishwasher called a dishwasher? Because they're washing dishes, right? And why is a chef called a chef? Because they're the chef, right? And the person in the past is called the past because that's what they're doing. Tanaim are people who teach, right? Tana means to teach. Amora means to say. As if to say, Tanaim were original Torah teachers who were part of a project of giving voice to oral tradition.
Are these the Rishonim? Is it the same thing?
No, so we'll come back to Rishonim. So
Sorry.
the Tanaim are the first generation of the oral tradition in the post-biblical era who were involved in the art of writing their ideas. I mean, if you're talking about Yehuda Natsi, who already wrote down the Mishnah, but even previous scholars still jotted down their teachings. They're living in a very tense time. The temple is about to be destroyed or has just been destroyed. Basically, the whole framework of living as Jews is being ripped from under our feet. So we're losing or have lost the temple. We're losing or have lost the land, right, to some way or another. And so there's a project of teaching the things which have been shared orally in a much more coherent way with that, because we realize that we're under threat and because we realize that there's a shift taking place. I mean, I began by saying, literally, you can feel the shift in the air of how Israel is this week than it was this time last week. I mean, Pashut. So the sages felt that there was a shift in the air and they needed to therefore be much more intentional in expressing and teaching the old tradition. So they're called Tanaim. When those generations, because we have generations of Tanaim listed here, right? There are 6 generations of Tanaim. when they do their work for various reasons, and when a body of work has now been created and formalized by Yudah Nasi called the Mishnah, you have a whole different series of scholars who say, okay, well, our job is to make sense of what these people said because they were terse, they were brief because they wanted to maintain a certain orality of the Jewish tradition. The Mishnah is still what David Weiss Halivni calls apodictic, very, very brief in terms of its attempts to explain the law. So it needed further discussion. Amoraim are discussers, right? A lot of the Talmud is all about discussion. So if you knew the Tanaim because they were teaching things in a very intentional way based on particular need, you knew the Amoraim because they were discussing things in an intentional way based on the need, right? The Stamaim, literally, as Alivni calls them, are the ones who say it's not about us. We just want to make sense of the, this.
It's like an addition.
Edition video, right? And the Savorim are a bit of a cherry on the cake. Again, they're relatively fleeting period of time who are just trying to clarify certain particular things which clearly were on their mind. And then once that was all done, once the Talmud is basically created and out there in one respect or another, then you have the Geonim. Who are the Geonim? The sages whose job is to lead primarily diaspora Jewry, because by that point most Jews were in the diaspora, whose job is to learn the Mishnah, to learn the Talmud, and use that as a source of authority to teach the Jewish world. So the Geonim is when you have the first formal response, where people are writing to rabbis saying, what do I do? And they, the first generation, so are saying, look at the Mishnah, look at the Talmud. Right, exactly. Rav Amram Gaon and Rav Sadia Gaon, right? The first Sidurim come from that period. The Geonim are incredibly important in terms of creating almost a formality of Jewish living based around the book and the written word, including the written word of the oral tradition. And the period of Rishonim basically begins with Rashi, a couple of years beforehand, but basically begins around about the middle of the 11th century, and the period of what known as Achronim begins around about the 16th century, around about the time of the Shulchan Aruch. Why these divisions? Part of it's to do with authority, part of it's also to do with printing, right? Because that also becomes an important shift. So if you have to divide the periods of Jewish history, you have Anshe Knesset Agdola, Zugot, Tanaim, Amoraim, Stamaim, Yasano, Savoim, to a certain measure, Geonim, Rishonim, Achronim. Right, but these labels, though Rishonim, Achronim are a little bit confusing because it suggests they come earlier than when they do.
That's
Right.
And indeed, when the period of Achronim end, more or less.
Well, arguably within the period, we have earlier Achronim and later Achronim. So our rabbis today are later Achronim. We're still in the Achronim. Right?
Some other articles book called Achronim. It's
Right.
There's one called Rishonim as well, but I've never.
Right, I know them.
It's also interesting.
It's very fascinating.
It goes by the 60s.
Right. So, but again, you tell almost by the work. So just to give you a completely random example of that, and this is just one feature of his genius, although unfortunately we live in very fractured worlds whereby denominationalism leads to us marginalizing people perhaps more than we should. You know, when the Cairo Geniza was, there was this area, perhaps I'll just take a step back. When we say Geniza, we're in a shul, right? If somebody has Sidurim or Chumashim that are broken apart, what do? We put in Geniza. Geniza literally means to hide away, but generally what we do is you bury them, right? But in certain places, in certain countries, it literally was hidden away. So there was various shuls, including one in Egypt, in Cairo, whereby they had an attic, and whatever they did with the old written prayers and things like that, they were just put in the attic. Geniza, meaning they're broken, we can't use them, or they're flawed, but we're not going to bury them either, because what's the point? So we just put them in this attic. So for many, many hundreds of years, this shul kept on storing old bits of stuff, right, in its Geniza. And then in the 19th century, as the British often did. They went around and they found this shul, and they found this geniza, right? And this treasure trove of hundreds of years of ancient manuscripts from basically around about the time of their going in till way past the time of the Rambam, right? What they did was they basically just put them on boats, took them to England and took them to Cambridge, right? You may have heard of the Cairo Geniza in Cambridge. And the reason I mention that is the person who did the first amount of work on that is Solomon Schechter. And there's a famous picture of him in a room about this size with scraps of these manuscripts, not quite paper, all over. And this is way before computers. And what did Solomon Schechter do? He was incredibly learned. So he'd pick up a piece of paper and he'd say, this is from Jeremiah, this is from the Geonim, this is from Rashi. How do you know? Because his brain is a computer, right? Now, part of that is because you're brilliant, but part of it is also because the tone of a text, right? We know that Geonim's writings, they have a certain tone, right? We know the Rishonim's writings and certain parts of it because they have a certain tone, meaning the more you're trained in thinking, the more you can literally pick up a random piece of paper and get a sense of where it's from. Right. Right. So
The Cairo Geniza is very interesting. The Cairo Geniza is interesting because it's not just manuscripts. It's business contracts. It's all kinds of things that they can actually learn about the time periods and what was going on.
It's absolutely fascinating. There's a whole bunch of books about it. I have one by Stefan Reif, who was the head of the curator of the Geniza. In fact, for my 30th birthday, my wife gave me a private tour of the Cairo Geniza. She paid for something. We basically went, and you get to see handwritten things in the Rambam. Right.
Sister in Cambridge.
Yeah, of course. So I mean, their website is excellent, but to go and to literally hold writings that the Rambam wrote, you know, is a remarkable thing. But the reason I mention that is because the categorization of all those texts comes as a result of great scholarship, but also understanding the tone and style of writing from different periods of time. So a Gaonic responsum reads different to one from the Rishonim. I could tell you a few features, but it's a bit like an artist would say, oh, that's Rembrandt, or that's like the period of Rembrandt, right? There's a whoosh. Malcolm Gladwell has a book, Blink. Sometimes even before you've even started reading it. And I know this is from the early days. So kachazeh. Now, I've rambled on way too much, but we've gone through this table. We've talked about the Tanaim and Amoraim and how they live in different places in Bavel and Israel, and different places in Bavel and Israel. Let's briefly look at this map. What's wonderful is, some of the places where we live is listed on this map, which is a remarkable thing. Got Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Yavne, Lod, Yafo, Bnei Brak, Caesarea, Sipori, right? I was in Sipori a few months ago. How different people in different neighborhoods related to one another is also fascinating, because the Jews who lived in Jerusalem, where they had the main centers of learning, often felt the people who lived further away from Jerusalem were more disconnected. How we talk about how people are in town or out of town, yeah? I learned that when I started teaching American seminaries, because in England, everything's out of town, I suppose. Right, but in America, you have, they're from town and they're from out of town. Well, in Israel, Jerusalem was town and the Galilee was out of town. But later on, but for the Mishnah period, Galilee is out of town. The reason why I mention that,
It's no Sfat.
right. The reason I mention that is one of the factors, and this is going to be just one session, although we'll reference a little bit more on others, and we just need to know a little bit about history. One of the factors which led to the clear view of the sages that Jesus of the Galilee has very little to teach them is because he's from the Galilee. And people from the Galilee were generally considered to be not great country bumpkins, right? Meaning that was a cloud not just for him, for everybody there. For a number of generations, we have Mishnayot, which basically say People in Jerusalem, they do the right thing. People in Galilee, because we don't think they're going to do the right thing, we need to be more machmir because basically they're ignoramuses, either Amei Aretz. So once you know that, a person who comes from the Galilee and says, I have things to teach you, right? They say, no, you don't. No, we have things to teach you. It's hubris for you to think otherwise. That's, one of a million factors why there was a difficulty in tension in the air, but just knowing that matters. It helps you understand Mishnayot. You should know that Christian scholars look to Mishnah to make sense of some of the events that are described in their tradition, shall we say. You may know there's a scholar called Gezer Burmis, who was born Jewish, but certainly didn't live a Jewish life. But in his books, he quotes the Mishnah in order to understand why Jesus said this and why people said that. And the best sources actually are our sources, right? Because they give a fair depiction of what was going on in Israel basically at that time. Anywho, those are the maps, those are the tables, those are the timelines. What I want to do now is whet your appetite without doing a thorough thing. Okay, so we're going to do something imperfect, just to kind of keep you on shoulders. Can you see there's a page which I've given you called Example Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah? And the first source here is a Mishnah, which all of us probably know Baal Peh. All of us probably know by heart. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, right? Why? Because we say it on Leil HaSeder, right? There's a debate as to whether we're supposed to mention the Exodus at night. We're supposed to mention the Exodus every day, but he's supposed to mention it at night. Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, says Elazar ben Azariah, Harei ani keven 70 shana, lo zachiti shte'amar yetziat mitzrayim beleilot ad shedarsha ben zoma. He said, I'm approximately 70 years old, and I've long held this opinion. Here I'm reading from the commentary of Rabbi Steinsaltz there. I was never privileged to prevail to prove that there is a biblical obligation to fulfill the accepted custom of talking about Exodus at nighttime until Ben Zoma interpreted this verse in this particular way. Whatever. In our collective lifetimes, we've all probably heard hundreds of Divrei Torah just on this very piece of, on this very Mishnah, which again is found in the Haggadah Shel Pesach. You probably know that when he says, I'm like a 70-year-old, that according to most commentaries is really like 17 years old, but he's like, and apparently he sprung gray hairs because he was appointed as the head of the academy, right, in Yavne. And so to even understand that line, just to understand I'm like a 70-year-old and his almost obsession with age, like, why do I care how old you feel? I feel old the whole time. Thanks very much. I don't share it. Like, what's it got to do with anything? Yeah, no. Thanks for my blessings. So, but like, what has it got to do with anything? The answer is, to understand Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah at that point in time, you need to know that he's a younger scholar competing and being put in a position of leadership alongside older scholars. And he has a lot of, not maturing as if he's immature, but a lot of work to do in terms of the optics of his position. Now, I just want to jump to source 4. I mentioned Rabbi Haber's book. He has a very long piece about Elazar ben Azariah because there are 3 teachings by him. Here he just mentions a short, this is just a shorter excerpt of the longer essay. כפי הנראה העריך רבי אלעזר בן עזריה ימים והגיע ל-70 כי נולד שנים אחדות קודם החורבן. When was he born? He was born a few years before the Khurban, okay? So Elazar ben Azariah is born, we can look at scholarly books, but a few years before the year 70 of the Common Era when the Second Temple was destroyed. ובפטירת רבי יוחנן בן זכאי היה לערך בין 13 שנה. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who asks Vespasian, Teni Yavne v'chachamea, it's Gemara in Gittin, right? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is approximately 13 years old. K'shu Nasi, and when he's given the presidency of the now what's going to become the remaining hub of significant creative Torah leadership in Israel, namely Yavne, he is about 16 or 18 years old. We can say 17, that ballpark, right? וכך פטירת רבי גמליאל, כי ידוע שרבי גמליאל נפטר קודם רבי אליעזר, והיה בפטירת רבי אליעזר, ושרבי אלעזר בן עזריה קרא בגדיו ואמר לחכמים רבותיי, ברור רבי אליעזר שטהור. Okay, so he's just giving us a little bit of context. But Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he lives from before the Churban to become one of the sages who develops the post-temple Torah, which arguably saves the Jewish people from marginalization. You know, the whole debate about whether Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai should have asked more or less from Vespasian is a topic we're going to come to. But still knowing that he was given this tremendous position of leadership at a young age means that he's often thinking about age and time, and he's living at one of the most dramatic periods of Jewish history, and he's hoping for better times. Curiously, he is like the 10th generation from the time of Ezra. Like he has an ancestor who lived. So what do we know about the number 70? I mentioned Ezra.
Even the Sanhedrin.
That true, but more significantly, we learn from the book of Yirmiyahu that the first Galut is going to last 70 years, right? The period between Churban the Beit Rishon and Bniyat Beit Sheni is 70 years, right? We are sent in exile to Babel for principally a number of years. The Jews come back 52 years later. There were some shenanigans, so we say. Eventually, the Beit Sheni is built 70 years and fulfilling the prophecy of Yirmiyahu. 70 isn't just a span of life, it's a span from destruction to rebuilding. You have a scholar who lives before the destruction of the Second Temple, who is put in a very, very difficult predicament. And what is he aching for? What is he yearning for? Obviously, better times. So in terms of his personal life, he's wondering, how can I get to be perceived perhaps as an older sage where I might have more leverage? But in addition to that, nationally, he's also hoping for a time where there's going to be a new temple. I mention that for no particular reason other than the following. Let's have a look at the next two sources I bring. They're not in any which way related to the Mishnah and Brachot, other than the fact they also contain teachings from Elazar ben Azariah. I want to read source 2. I'm going to read it in Hebrew and in English. Tanya Eliezer Omer, Yimot Moshiach 40 Shana. Eliezer says the Messianic era will be 40 years long, as it's stated, and he quotes a pasuk from Tehillim. Elazar ben Azariah Omer 70 Shana. He believes that the Messianic era is going to last 70 years. And why? He brings a pasuk from Yeshayahu, V'yab Yamohu, Nishkachat Tzor 70 Shana ki mei melech echad. Ez melech yuchad, hava omer ze Moshiach. Do I even understand what he's saying here? No, I have no idea, because this comes from Perek Chelek. This is discussing messianic ideas. You need to know that even what is being said ambiguously. But I do know that he associates the messianic era with the number 70, right?
Also in the previous,
Oh, exactly. The previous, he didn't just mention Aneka ben Shivim Shana. All of a sudden, he quotes the teaching of Ben Zoma, which says, we learn from this pasuk, you're supposed to talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, Ma'avalei Lot, etc. Elavim not Mashiach.
the Mashiach.
And let's look at the third teaching. There's a debate as the Sanhedrin. This is already before his birth, but as the Sanhedrin has waned and stopped doing capital punishment, there's a debate about whether it should or it could, or the regularity in which capital punishment should be practiced. Sanhedrin principally should be able to function in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. A Sanhedrin that executes a transgressor once in every 7 years is considered to be destructive. Right? He says if they do it even once every 70 years, that's very destructive. Now, here's the deal. I said I'm doing this to whet your appetite. Do I think that all these three teachings are talking about the same thing? No. One is talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim, one is talking about Moshiach, one is talking about Sanhedrin.
But what you said before, that's a mindset.
Right. There's a certain mindset of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah about the number 70. Now, do I know what that is? I don't know, honestly. I mean, I could postulate, I could suggest. We could talk about the lifespan of a person. We could talk about Yirmiyahu. We could talk about the transition from destruction to rebuilding. But he thinks in terms of certain periods of time. Now, when rabbis use numbers, sometimes they mean it literally, sometimes they mean it symbolically. It was quite clear that Elazar ben Azariah has an interest in the symbolism of the number 70, right? Now, it's up to us to determine what that is. I'm not here to say, I know. What I am saying is, when you lean into a certain sage and you read a certain text, and this one is so familiar to us, it's almost so familiar we forget that there are still many questions that need to be asked. Shiv'im, right? Why is that important to you? Why do you say you're Ben Shishim? Why you're not being 40? Why do you say Ben Arbaim? What's so special about 70? And what's it got to do with Moshiach? And now he talks about how the Messianic period is going to last 70 years. I'm like, where'd you get that from? I mean, it's, do you really hear it in the verse? And then he talks about how even capital punishment done every 70 years would mar, shall we say, the general spirit of the Jewish people. Why? I think even when you take a small, tiny fragment of information of a sage like this, of which I'm not trying to build anything, I'm just trying to throw some details to the wind, you realize that there is more to our sages than meet the eye. And that we have almost a duty of care to them and duty of care to ourselves to pay more attention to who these people are. It's all very well and good when we learn Mishnayot and Tisim the Talmud that we kind of skip the names and get to the teaching. Or when it's a famous name, we may think we know more about them. But maybe we don't. I'll give you one more example, and then we'll finish. A famous story of Rabbi Akiva is that he bought his wife Rachel a Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. What is a Yerushalayim Shel Zahav? It's not a song. Obviously, that song is based on that story. What does he buy her? A form of tiara, shall we say, right? It's exactly a tiara, isn't it? But something like that. Okay. Why? We generally say because he loves his wife and he loves Jerusalem. That's a good enough reason. If I'd say to my wife, I need to have a reason before I buy you jewelry, she'd say, you don't need to have a reason. Just buy the jewelry. Thank you. But then, we are also told a story how when Rabbi Akiva was giving a shiur, he was explaining the crowns of the letters of a Torah. Now, Tegman Menachot, right? Ordinarily, you don't even think about them as being relevant. One is a personal story about buying his wife a tiara, and one is a story actually relating to theology, this thing about Moshe Rabbeinu being in the room, right? But maybe Rabbi Akiva has a thing about crowns. And then, for example, we have a teaching, right?
He also pulls the hay out of his wife's hair.
Right. And then, and this is mentioned here in this sefer that I brought. And then we have a very interesting din where he talks about an Isha Nida, that Gam Isha Nida titkashet, Shim lo ken titkana al ba'ala. There's a debate whether, in the time of the sages, to what extent should a woman beautify herself when she's in a state of Nida, or cosmetics and such. If you're interested in that topic, Hannah Safrai wrote an essay on that, which can be found in that book, Jewish Legal Writings by Women, right? But Rabbi Akiva takes a view, of course, she should wear jewelry, titkashet, right? Again, what do I think that there's a connection between these two teachings? I don't know. What I do know is, here's a rabbi who seems to be particularly understanding the psychology of jewelry for women, who buys his wife a particularly unique piece of jewelry. And when he comments on Torah, he talks about the jewelry, shall we say, of the words of the Torah. And of course, he relates to Torah as if she is a beautiful woman, because he talks about how Shir HaShirim is Kodesh Kodashim, right? And you bring all these things together, you realize maybe these disparate teachings are reflective of a deeper aspect of Rabbi Akiva that I never fully noticed. Because I heard that story, but I didn't connect them because I didn't take enough time to ask myself, who is this person? Not that I'll fully understand. Let's say Rabbi Akiva is a person who looks for beauty even in the less than obvious places. We know that from that story in Makot, where the temple is destroyed, and yet he sees something that other people don't see. The idea of promoting, endorsing women, using cosmetics and wearing jewelry where others didn't think it was appropriate, it's also reflective of a certain mindset. I'd say you can learn a lot about Rabbi Akiva just by dwelling on his interest in beauty and accessories, shall we say, and crowns.
And optimism.
Right, and optimism. Like even that is an interesting window into him, and we know certain windows which we will lean on, like that story Makot. Let's say
Even the story of him being combed with the combs when he says he never thought
Oh.
he had an opportunity to say B'chol B'chol.
okay, right.
Okay.
So we all
Can you repeat what she said?
we're talking about how even at the end of his life, Rabbi Akiva's skin was combed with metal combs by the Romans in a very brutal way. And yet, even when that happens, he says, in this moment, I'm able to fulfill the commandment of serving God with my entire soul. And there's also, basically, even within that moment, you see the ability to see, I wouldn't say beauty, but
Positivity.
so yes, something beyond the moment, right? So what I want us to do in this course, it's not purely history. I'm not a historian. I don't claim to be. It's not purely halakhic. We're not just going to be looking at halakhic teachings. It's not purely Mishnah and Talmud. We're not just going to learn bits and bobs. It's taking teachings and taking historical fact, right? And taking a little bit of our understanding of context and asking questions, right? We're going to basically be detectives. Some of it, we're going to hear the conclusions of people like Benny Lau and Gershon Beda. Some we're going to reach our own conclusions. Some will probably leave things and leave them as being inconclusive. What I do believe is that the more we reflect on the lives of our sages, the more we're more likely to understand the teachings of our sages. And here is a great example. If you only knew this first Mishnah, you'd say, okay, he's just a guy who feels a little bit uneasy about being the head of an academy when he's a young person. I'd say no. There's a lot more to Elazar ben Azariah in the number 70 than just his age. That's to think that is to not understand him. It's not to pay attention to his teachings. He has a view of possibility and a hope for redemption and a desire that the future isn't bleak. And that makes sense. It makes complete sense. And so even a seemingly marginal remark in one place in the Talmud can be a piece of evidence to understand a further piece of Talmud. And I want to end with one, a beautiful teaching based on the verse of Mishlei. Every Friday night we sing Eshet Chayil, and chapter 31, the final parak of Mishlei, which is Eshet Chayil, we say, Hayta ka'an yotzacher memerchak tavi lachma. She's like a merchant ship from great distance, she brings her wares. On this, our sages, the Yerushalmi and Tosfot also have a beautiful klal called Divrei Torah anim b'makom echad v'ashirim b'makom acher. The words of Torah are poor in one area and rich in the other, meaning sometimes to understand one teaching, you need to look in less than obvious places. Okay, so to take that's to understand this teaching in Mishnah Brachot, we actually need to dwell a little bit more on this teaching Masechet Makot, right? Now, it's not to say you can't understand the teaching Mishnah Brachot.
That's much more superficial.
Right. So looking beyond the particular text you're learning is important. and it's itself also a word of warning and a reminder of being a little bit more humble. Sometimes a person says, I'm preparing a Dvar Torah. I looked at this verse, I looked at this Rashi, this is my Dvar Torah. It'd be like, well, there's a Rashi elsewhere which helps you understand this Rashi. They'd say, how do you know that? I'd say, well, you have to learn. Meaning, don't think that you know everything because you just looked at the most obvious place, right? In order to understand that Rashi, you have to look at a different Rashi or a different comment of the Ramban who challenges that Rashi. And that's why Torah is a never-ending endeavor, but always be looking at the less than obvious places. So here too, to understand the lives of our sages, looking at the less than obvious places, I think will help us better understand their teachings in the more obvious places. And that's what Rabbi Haber does in his Levavot commentary. Where you're reading Pirkei Avot and he says, yeah, but there's that statement in Zvachim, which helps to explain why this person is talking about this thing, which therefore makes more sense of this particular teaching. And once you learn that, you say, wow, now I understand why this sage is saying this in Pirkei Avot. So if you want to see an example of how to almost apply this methodology to a text which is so familiar to us, go knock on his door or something, get a copy of. I haven't seen many. I don't know why. Maybe I'm not his book promoter, but what I do know is this is a great book, and it's a great example of how to bring this kind of thinking to work that's so familiar. So I wish you well. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Matan. And we're going to get going with Anshe Knesset Agdolah.
Ben is.
My